Welcome to our 38th SLiTHER. So SLiTHER is just like a webinar, basically. I just kind of got a weird snake name there. But this is all about the primarily undergraduate institution faculty job search, and we have a great panel. You can see them listed down here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But basically, I'm not going to show this slide the whole time, but I just want to give kind of an outline. I figure our panelists will introduce themselves, and then each of you can just sort of say, I put what is a PUI faculty position like, but maybe you can just say like, what is your faculty position like? Because they're all a little different. And then we can get an overview of the application and search process. A lot of people were interested in what committees are looking for, what makes a competitive candidate. And then I think it shouldn't be overlooked that the candidates should also be looking at what would be a good position for them. So I think like trying to figure out how that might fit in. And then we can open it up for questions. And we did have some submissions for questions, so I'll try to slot those in when we can. So I'm going to kind of keep us on this outline, but I'm not going to keep the screen up here. So if you guys want to go ahead, our panelists, if you want to introduce yourself, you can just sort of say where you are, how long you've been there, how you've been involved with job searches before. Whoever wants to go first. Madeline, why don't you go ahead?
All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Madeline Radlauer. I am in my 6th year at San Jose State. We are a primarily undergraduate institution, but we also do have a small master's program. We are also a large public institution and a minority serving institution, ANAPZ, HSI, all of those wonderful things. So I have been on search committees now. I think I'm on my 6th one this semester. So we have our faculty, basically, there are a lot of people retiring, or there were a lot of people retiring right when I started. And so we're trying to fill those positions again. So it just happens that that's been there. So I've been on successful search committees and failed search committees, and I'm excited to tell you about kind of what the process is like.
Great. Chris, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Chris Whitehead at Union College in kind of upstate New York. In my first year here, first month, everything's very, very fresh. Union College is a PUI, liberal arts, and a SLaTH, and so it's a private institution. I'm not sure what else I'm supposed to say, but yeah, that's where we are. I have not sat on any search committee yet, just been on the other side.
Yeah, recently went through that, so that'll be a good perspective. What about you, Jacob?
Hi, I'm Jacob Lutter. I am also a new hire, so my perspective is more so on the candidate side. I was just hired at University of Southern Indiana, started around sometime in July, and this university is primarily undergraduate. It's a PUI. It's rather small. Enrollment is on the order of around 2,000 to 3,000 right now. Kind of serves a little bit of a niche in Southern Indiana, but the students are absolutely wonderful.
Great, thank you. I've also been on some search committees, and Anne Bentley's probably also been on some, so we can probably also say some stuff there too. I thought we could just say a little bit about like what a PUI faculty position is like, because it's really different coming from graduate school or a postdoc. There were some questions about like research and teaching, like how much of those things you're doing at those positions. So maybe you could just like address that a little bit about what a position like this would be like. I'll let you go however you want there.
Why don't y'all start since you just started, and then I'll add in from.
All right. Yeah, so I mean, my position here, so in theory split 45, 45, 10 for teaching, research, and service. That being said, I mean, especially they say the first year, it's almost entirely teaching and getting your lab set up and trying to get things going. I think for me as well, this position, there's a high research expectation as well. And I'll touch on that a little bit later when related kind of to one of the other big questions about how to know what a position is good for you or not. But it kind of, so I know that coming in. And so with that, there's been some intentionality over what courses I teach in my first year to try to allow me to have a little bit of time, hopefully, to order equipment and get it set up and that type of thing.
My position is more teaching oriented than it sounds like Chris's is, where the bulk of my load is right now teaching 3 sections of Gen Chem. I am in the process of getting my lab together. I had a huge head start in my postdoc, which I can talk about a little bit later. So I've actually already got undergraduate research running at my postdoc institution, and I'm more so transferring that here. So it's something that I'm getting back into. I just got 2 students that are starting in the lab this week. Really excited about that. But in terms of load, yeah, there's a lot more teaching going on in my life, and that's going to be the way that it is.
All right, so at San Jose State, our administration is a bit in flux, and so like the exact percentages are not things I can really speak to. There's an expectation for research, that you have an active research group throughout your tenure at San Jose State. I'm a little crazy. I'm going to put that out front there. And I've at this point had 48 students in my group, undergraduates and master's students. If I average my alumni, they stay at least 2 years in the lab. So it's tends to be on the order of 12 to 18 students at a time. And that includes throughout COVID. So now they weren't in the lab actively when we were, closed down. And so I was doing stuff online and online training and kind of making like workshop type things. But that's more students than most people have. But I have a really hard time saying no to excited undergraduates, and that's part of the reason I wanted this job, right? Like I'm at a school where we have a lot of students, and a lot of students who are really excited about science and are really excited about chemistry, and you get talking to them and you're like, yes, let's do this, let's have you join the group. So with that, I actually run 6 sub projects. So my group has 2 overarching projects that are both federally funded right now. So I'm like really happy about that. And then under each of those, I have subgroups of students. And so that way I'm not running, 18 different projects, I'm running 6. And so I can meet with like the students as groups, I can train them in groups, and that like makes sense and works for me. I also teach a 2-2, so 2 classes in the fall and 2 classes in the spring. And then in terms of service, you build up your service over time at a place like SJSU. So like in my first couple years, I was like on a couple committees, and now I'm chair of our chemistry curriculum committee, and now I'm on the college level curriculum committee as well. I also involved with the local ACS section and some other service outside of the university, which is looked on really well. But in terms of service, the amount of service you do, especially pre-tenure, is very much up to you and what you think is right for you, and what you're excited about. So if basically what happens is I get excited or involved in something and say, ooh, I want to join and make it better and like be part of that. I see how I can make a difference. And then I end up having more service than I'm maybe healthy. So just like putting that out there as well, like service is part of your job, but it doesn't, like how much part of your job it is more dependent on you than you may think. So I'm again on a recruitment committee, but that's also in part because I care a lot about who we bring in, and so we can talk about that soon.
Great, thank you. I'll just add one more perspective here. I'm at Southeast Missouri State. I've been here, this is my 6th year. It's a regional public university, and so we have pretty high teaching loads. We teach like 12 to 15 contact hours. So I'm teaching 4 Gen Chem labs and a Gen Chem lecture. So it's a lot, but we still do have a research expectation of like 2 publications for tenure or a publication and an external grant. So making that all work is a little tricky, but it's fun because you can bring things together at a PUI differently than at other places. Like you can do some of your research in one of your classes, or there's just ways you can be creative about it. So anyway, that's just kind of one of the things I like about it is you can kind of overlap different parts of your professional life. Okay, just switching gears a little bit. So what's the overview of the application process and search process? Maybe we can get it from the search committee side, and then we can get it from the person who's on the job search. So I'll let you go first, Madeline.
Sure. So from the search committee side, once we have an applicant pool, right? Like, so while y'all are all filling out your applications, like I'm not allowed to look at anything. And yeah, basically it's like closed off to me until our diversity, equity, inclusion office and our human resources office looks through the pool and says, this is an acceptable pool, we can move forward. And then part of the reason they're looking through the pool is also so that when we start narrowing down the pool, they can say, okay, it seems like a reasonable change in, like, if there's a change in demographic profile of the pool in narrowing it down, they might come back to us and be like, let's double check your biases. So far that hasn't happened to us. So I think we're doing okay. But that is something that we have to like be very cognizant of. And at the same time, not cognizant of, because we're not allowed to hire, based on any demographic information, but we have to make sure that we're not thinking about demographic information in a negative way either. So we have to be careful and aim to like see where our biases may come from. And so one of the other things about biases is not just, racial and ethnic. It's also about what schools people are coming from. And I think that and what opportunities those schools provide and what mentorship those schools provide is another thing that I think it's harder to check for at the DEI office, but it's something that we think about in our when we talk about stuff like, hey, do they have yes, they publish these papers, but what school are they coming from? What resources do they have there? So anyway, once the pool gets to us, we typically do a first run through, and I will admit it's actually pretty easy to do the first cut. And the reason is we get a lot of people who are applying to a minority serving institution at a PZ, a HSI. We have amazing students. We represent amazing diversity in Silicon Valley. We're a primarily undergraduate institution, and they don't mention our students once. It's gone. So if you're not mentioning that you want to work with these awesome students, we don't want you to work with them either. And that's it. Then the other thing is if they start mentioning PhD students, they obviously haven't read up about our institution. Gone. And then if they don't talk about, so on the other hand, if they don't talk about undergraduates, gone. Because we have undergraduates and master's students. So if you're not talking about doing research with undergraduates and master's students, that's a pretty straightforward miss. Outside of those three things, it's not as easy. And so then it's about what do we think of the research proposals? What do we think of the teaching statement? What do we think of the diversity statement? I mean, we read through every single piece of paper, and try to put together stuff. We try to avoid reading or at least I try to avoid reading the recommendations in my first pass through. Because while recommendations can tell you a lot, especially if you're like, ooh, this is kind of striking me the wrong way, a recommendation might help clear things up, but recommendations have a lot of bias in them. And especially if you know someone who wrote one of the recommendations, then you're you can become really biased towards a person. So then we get together as a team and think about how to narrow down the pool. If we get narrow enough, So the first time through, we usually have like right now we have 7, 3 out of our 7 people look at every single one of the things. So 3 eyes on. And then if there's consensus of like, ooh, this is a possibility, this is kind of, on the fence, maybe a maybe. And then this is a no, then we can kind of separate down. And then we get more eyes on to the ones that are maybes and probable next stagers. The next stage, if we have a lot of good applicants, the next stage is to narrow it down for phone interviews or Zoom interviews. And then for the Zoom interviews, we want to keep it short, and we're going to basically think about the things that we were kind of like most excited about and most worried about with our set of candidates, and make the exact same questions for everybody, but try to cover those pieces. And then we also always make sure to have our candidates do a research plug, like what, give us an intro to research. Typically it's give us an introduction to your research lab as if we are undergraduates, to kind of see how you might try to recruit students once you get here. So that can be pretty fun. Or sometimes people take it like super high level and you're like, some of these undergraduates just finished Gen Chem, like let's, and so that gives us a good sense of a good feel of how things are. And then after the Zoom interviews, we narrow the pool again, and we'll do in full day interviews. I think we're going back to in-person. I think that it's really great to have people on campus because they can feel the vibrancy, they can see we have construction going on. So I think that that will be exciting because new building, right? And new science building, which is totally thrilling. And a few other things. So it's we want people to be on campus, and that interview is very much it goes both ways type interview. We're trying to show you our best, and we're also trying to see what your best looks like. And then, we'll have several presentations in one day. It's super exhausting, but we know it's exhausting. So we don't hold that against you. In fact, there have been people who by the end of the day, they're like, whoo, and you're just like, it's okay. We understand, just get through this one more presentation for us. And we'll go out and have dinner and have a good time. And that hasn't meant that we haven't given them an offer either. It's we understand it's a long day, but usually there's a teaching demo, a presentation of previous research. The presentation of previous research is for everybody. So master's students and undergraduates are invited. The teaching demo is usually just for the faculty, but you're supposed to treat us like undergraduates who are in that stage in that class. And then finally, we have a research proposals presentation. And that's when we're going to ask you, why do you want to come to SJSU? What do you actually, we'll ask you the hard questions. And I mean, they're not hard questions, but they're ones that we want to really see that you're thinking about the institution and whether you're a good fit. Sorry if that went a little long.
And that one's just for the search committee as well, for the proposal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then afterwards, after you see everybody, then you
deliberate,
reconvene and try to hit a consensus.
Yeah, and usually when we're at the stage of in-person interviews, it's 3 or 4 candidates, and it can be hard. Sometimes it's straightforward. Sometimes everybody's like, this is the person we want, and sometimes there are 2, and you're like, I really want this person. They really want wow. So it can be tough, but I think it's a really good process in that we want to hire someone who's going to succeed at our institution, and who we're going to have a really good time working with. So I like it.
Great. Yeah. So how about we'll have Chris and Jacob just sort of talk a little bit about things that they may have seen along the way, if you had to give different kinds of talks or whatever. And then we'll go into the actual, what those components of your application look like in a minute. After you guys talk about this, we'll open up, make sure no one has any questions, and then we'll keep going. So Jacob, why don't you say if there's anything you want to add to what the process was like from your standpoint?
Yeah, so Madeline's description describes quite a lot of what I experienced. I did not do a shotgun approach, so I was avoiding the idea of what Madeline said, where did you look up the institution? Are you mentioning the right things? Don't waste your time or theirs. If you're applying for a PUI job, do your research. It's the easiest way to get through that first pass. So I'm so glad she mentioned that. I would also recommend to kind of get a sense of what interest you're generating. Make a website for yourself that's almost a more visual, interactive presentation of your CV. Is you can use that website to track web traffic and see who's looking at you from what state. So you get a sense, okay, this university I applied to, it looks like some people from that university might be interested. I should study up on them a little bit because a Zoom interview is probably coming. That kind of thing. So I'd recommend you make a website, because not only does it make it easy for the search committee to get to know you, but it gives you a heads up if you're paying attention. It was probably the best piece of advice my postdoc advisor gave me for the job search. So yeah, you can tell when Zoom interviews are coming. It'll either be a Zoom interview and a phone interview, or a phone interview. You'll like the Zoom interview better. If you do a phone interview, that's how I got hired, through a phone interview, not a Zoom interview. I thought they were not going to talk to me again, but apparently the conversation went really well. So don't let that discourage you if it is a phone conversation. And from there, you're just kind of waiting for the invite to campus. And at any point, you can have exactly zero communication happen. That's normal. It sucks, but that's normal.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of parts along the way that can feel kind of awkward, like the phone interviews. A lot of times there's a whole search committee there and they're all writing their notes down or whatever. So things can be kind of awkward. And then along the way,
on the phone, it doesn't
committees are
flow as well,
meeting
but
and-
it still works.
Yeah. Hopefully we're mostly on Zoom, but yeah. If you want to add anything else, or we can, if Chris, if you want to say, were there certain kinds of presentations you had to give, or like anything unusual?
Yeah, I would just add just a couple little things to what they had said. So I'd say definitely the phone review is so awkward. So my little hack for that was I knew who I was going to be talking to. They told me the 3 people, and I just printed off their pictures and put them up in front of me so I could pretend to talk to someone. So it didn't feel as awkward. So that was just one fun little tip. That was the one I got, so it worked out. That's what I say. But then, so I had to do one presentation, and that was a 40-minute talk on my research, with the first 20 minutes as the teaching portion, where it had to be at basically a Gen Chem level. So I had to give a Gen Chem intro to nanoparticle nucleation and growth. So that was a little tricky. It took me a good solid 2 weeks to figure out. But with that, I think that threw me a little bit, but ended up being really fun. And you can do a lot of creative pieces with what they tell you. And a lot of that you can also get, I think there's a piece that happens sometimes that I didn't realize was possible at first, between the phone interview and that on-site. If you get the offer for the on-site, I highly recommend contacting the chair of that committee or the department chair to have an informal conversation. Some of them won't do it, some will, but just to ask some general questions. And so I got a lot of really useful information to help inform how I wanted to prepare for that on-site interview by doing just a short informal chat.
Yeah, I think that's great information. Like when you're going on campus for an interview, like know the audience for each presentation that you're going to give. If they say students, say, is this like first year students or is this like upper level students? And honestly, a lot of those mock teaching things are super awkward. They're not always great, but like the idea is that you show that you want to teach and that you have put some effort into it.
I'm going to add on the mock teaching. It is a little awkward. I agree with that completely. But keep in mind, you don't have to get through all the material. What we really want to see is like what you would be like in a classroom. And so if you were only given 10 minutes and you're like, oh, I could lecture on this material for 10 minutes. Helpful. Like, seriously not helpful. You're going to lecture at us basically when you give your research talk. So don't lecture, like use all of the teaching techniques that you're excited to try, like try something and practice it on your friends first. Like don't have us be your practice, but like you know, if you came in, so I brought in a worksheet that like everybody filled out with me as like we went through it was molecular orbital diagrams because I was inorganic. So I was expecting to have like senior level undergraduates, but like that was in the email. So that's the other thing, is read actually every bit of the email that you get. I know from like from my experience on both ends that these emails are kind of sometimes have a lot of information kind of packed in. And so read the email and like see, oh, like this is my student audience. And if they don't say what your audience is, just ask. Like that's a very reasonable question. We're not allowed to say like how you're doing in the process. Like if you call in before like we've figured out who our Zoom interviewees or our next stage interviewees are, we'll be like, we're working on it, and that's gonna be it. Sorry that there's no information. I think at the point where we do in-person interviews, the people who we said like an absolute no to at the beginning, we get to say an absolute no to, and like, but like if you don't hear anything, that's better than if you hear a no first. And like I always feel weird about the situation, like you don't hear very much. And like this like lack of communication that Jacob mentioned, it's like really true. So
yeah, but honestly, my rule of thumb, if you did not hear anything the next week, expect bad news.
From the
after a Zoom interview or after an
the,
on-site. If you did not hear anything after a week, expect bad news. You're at least going to be a second choice.
Probably, but sometimes getting everyone on campus is really crazy. And so
Yeah, but
sometimes it's
usually
like
that's communicated. So a week after you would
Often.
expect to hear something, if you haven't heard something, it's
Yeah.
not, yeah, don't expect a miracle.
The way I would temper that is I would say like at the end of a Zoom interview and at the end of an in-person interview, you can say, when do you expect to like make decisions for the next stage?
Yeah.
That's something I would ask pretty
question,
often, yes.
and you can definitely ask. And usually we'll already have all of those that stage interview scheduled and be ready to say, okay, we're meeting on this date, so we should have it shortly after that time. So we can give you a ballpark. And if you haven't heard at that point, then yeah, it's likely we're holding you in reserve, and you're not like the first choice if it's the last thing, or you're not making the next interview stage yet. But we also have a lot of people who turn down in-person interviews, which is kind of crazy. So don't be too discouraged if it's not right away. Like, and please don't hold it against us, because we don't mean it badly.
And you always have to ask, they always ask, do you have any questions? So that's a great question to ask, right? What's the timeline? What's it look like? So, it's kind of an easy one. You should have other questions, but that's a good one to have. Speaking of questions, let's just sort of like take a pause here. And like, we kind of covered what PUI faculty positions are like and a little bit about just like the structure of the search. We're going to get into like, what are search committees looking for? What are like competitive applications looking like? But if there are any questions just about the parts we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I submitted this as a question, but I can ask it as well now. Yeah. Do you have any advice for when looking at a job description, being able to suss out some of what they're looking for? The PUIs is an incredibly vast term, and so it goes from places that have like a 60-40 research to teaching to, I think, Jacob, you mentioned that you have like a overwhelming teaching focus. Is that something that gets communicated in a job posting, or is it something that you just have to talk to people who know about that institution?
You have to look at the department's website to really know the answer to that question. A lot of them are going to look like the same thing, where they say You will be expected to teach at this level these courses in general, inorganic, Gen Chem, blah, blah, blah. And you will be expected to form an independent research group, is typically the language. Sometimes they will say a externally funded independent research group. That's probably something more like what Chris is doing. So that can be a signal to you if they're expecting external funding. You're looking at a more research intensive PUI.
I think department size also like comes down to it. If they only have a couple faculty, you're all going to be, if there's 4 faculty members and you're teaching all the chemistry classes, then it's probably going to be pretty teaching heavy. Yeah, I think
ACS accredited versus not ACS accredited is also a pretty big tell into the level of research that's going on.
There's also like
it's not a perfect thing, but it correlates.
That's true. There's also like some limit to your upper limit to your teaching if there's a ACS accreditation. Sorry, Madeline, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, that was perfect. My dog was barking anyway.
Okay.
I would say that I agree. If you look at the website, that can help. Now, some people do not prioritize their website, which I think is a bummer, but like, I know that like a lot of the research groups in our department are not prioritizing their website because they're doing a gazillion other things. And so you have to choose what goes. And sometimes it's, website updates. But I would say that if you look at the department websites, you can typically see, like if they're doing research, you can typically see that research is mentioned on the front page. And so, but that's also a question you can contact the chair and ask, like, what is the teaching load? Teaching load is a really straightforward, statement into that. And I think, the number and types of students that are present. So like we have master's students and undergraduates, but like vastly more undergraduates than master's students. But the fact that we have master's students means that we have thesis, master's theses to advise for. And so that increases the amount of research expected.
And I think all these positions can be great, right? It just has to be a match with what you want. And then their expectations and what they provide or what the position is like has to match, right? So as long as their expectations and, what you're provided or how much teaching you have, as long as those match and it's something that fits for you, then it's a great position. So there's lots of different flavors, like you said. What about any other questions at this point?
Yeah. Hi, Zach Erbach here. What kind of considerations come up when matching the proposed research with the specific subfield calling? Because some are more broad and some are very specific. So how does that factor into the decision process or the new hires? How did you craft your statements?
So for us, we're looking for fit in the department, by which we mean, can you, with the startup you get, which is not huge. So I got 50 grand, it's gone up since then. And the instruments that we have on campus, and given like safety considerations and everything else, are you ready to lead a group in that research? That matters way more than the specific type of research you're doing. If you can, if we're looking in our current search, we're open, but there's some need for teaching in biochemistry. So we might end up giving some preference for people who could teach biochemistry. But if their research is not biochemistry, as long as it sounds like it'll be safe and feasible at our institution with our students, and you're excited about it, then it sounds like a good fit. Even when we've had a very specific, we want to look at, computational chemistry. We wanted a computational chemist, but the type of computational chemistry was anything that they wanted to propose that they felt they could do with undergraduates and master's students. And looking at an organic chemist, we had people from, materials to inorganic to, phys org to, total synthesis. We had the full range of it. And the type of research in particular didn't matter in terms of it was just about, is it safe? Is it feasible with our money and instrumentation and have they laid out a plan to do it with our types of students, our undergraduates and master's students?
So the one thing I'd add on that from my experience was that a lot of businesses I was looking at actually had kind of labeled what interdisciplinary field they were looking for with that. And so at the position I'm in now, they had identified that they wanted the person to have experience in inorganic, be able to teach inorganic and general chemistry, but that had research that was in either nanosciences or environmental. And that's when I started looking into the college more, I realized that it was a PUI liberal arts college that also had an engineering department. And because of that, they had a number of interdisciplinary programs and minors associated with that. And so and then I looked more and more, and it turns out there was a professor who had passed away from cancer, who had started the nanoscience program. And so they needed a chemist with nanoscience experience. And so I was looking at like, well, this is a perfect fit. And so that was a way I'm kind of starting to go down the rabbit hole of the university and get an idea of what is it that they're looking for? What do they have already in place that maybe they need someone to fill in for? Or is there an opportunity there for you to come in and create something too? So I think there are kind of to play both sides of that, but usually if there's some sort of niche component, they'll have it written and say, could contribute in this, or this. And then you can look at what does the current department do and see where you can fit to that.
And my little addition would be to emphasize something Madeline had said, in that when I crafted my research proposal, I specifically mentioned how undergrads are going to be doing the research. That's as important as communicating what the research is. Include a paragraph that says, these are the grants that I'm going to apply for, and have a plan. These are the instruments I need. Looking at your website, this is what you have. If you don't have it, here's my plan. Here's the person I can collaborate with.
Yeah, and here's the first thing I can do before I get it, right? And then I can, move on from there.
How long do I think this project will take? Is it going to be a 2 to 3 years, 1 to 2 years? What's the learning potential? That kind of thing. Try and touch on as much of that as you can.
Yeah.
So I was going to say fundability is important. So like at a place like SJSU, where we do have a lot of research, we're looking for you to branch away from things you've done before, at least a little bit, because if it's really a very small step from your postdoc, unless your postdoc advisor writes in their letter, I know they're taking this research and that's okay, then that's not okay by us, because we're like, okay, well, their postdoc advisor is going to get the funding for this, not them. And then that same, what Jacob just said, yes. But when you're guessing timeline, like remember that you're teaching a lot and that your students need a lot of training. And so something that might, as you are a postdoc or senior PhD student, you're like, oh, I could do this project in a year. Expect it to take 3, because that's like, you're not going to get a year's worth of lab time in your first year. There's no way. And so that's okay. And that's what's expected. Like, you don't do this job just to do research.
Yeah, I think all that's really good to say. And I think again, they have to have someone teach the classes that need to be taught. So I think, if you are applying for a biochemistry job and you can't teach biochemistry, that's probably a problem. But if you just have some other kind of research, I think it's great and students are going to love it, then that's perfect, right? That's still good. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit because we've got 15, 20 minutes here. Let's get into the nitty gritty of the application things you're going to put together. So the things you're going to send in. And then also we talked a little bit about the job talks, but as far as things you're going to send in, there was a question about, you're going to have these documents like a cover letter, right? And probably a teaching philosophy often, and a research proposal. And just sort of there was a question about the cover letter, how much do you put in the cover letter so it's not repeating just all your other stuff, or what are the, what's the first thing the search committee looks at, and what do you think they should focus on? That's a lot, but something with the paper documents you're submitting or electronic.
So for the cover letter, I wrote it as if I assumed it was the only thing they would read before contacting me further. So I had a paragraph that described my background, where I came from, why I am applying to a PUI. So I had to cover that, had to cover what my research background is, give a 3 to like at most 3 sentence introduction to what your research is. And then I also had a paragraph at the end where I specifically listed, I can teach this class, this class, this class, this class from your catalog. So those are the major points that I hit in my cover letter. Why am I interested in your PUI? What is my background? What is my research? What classes can I teach?
I would say that's pretty solid. I would add that you don't have to actually pull the catalog numbers, especially in the cover letter. If you say like, I'm prepared to teach, inorganic and Gen Chem, or I'm prepared to teach in these areas, or like I could very easily step in and teach inorganic, Gen Chem, and analytical, but with a little bit of refresher, also be able to teach in OChem or something like that. It always feels a little weird when people pull the numbers, because you wonder if like they actually know what those courses are, like how deep they actually went into those courses. And sometimes there are classes that only get taught like once every 4 years. And so it's not necessarily useful because like our master's classes don't get taught very often. But like you can say what your teaching interests are. And I think everything else that Jacob mentioned, I think the most important part of that cover letter is, why are you applying to us? That is absolutely the most important piece.
I think the one piece I think we haven't touched on that really is included in the cover letter, but I think it's included everywhere, but is how does your values and who you are align with that of the university or college you're applying to? And also for me especially, that is also identical to what are my take and feelings about diversity, equity, inclusion, respect, and belonging work, and how those concepts need to be intertwined into your entire research statement, your teaching statement, all of it, it's there. And showing your awareness and your ability, because perhaps you have not necessarily done this type of teaching or this type of this, but if you have an awareness of that, and you can understand why it matters and how it can impact students and benefit the students, that is incredibly powerful.
And if you're asked about that and you don't address it, that can really like flag your application as well. Or if it's in a phone interview or something and you don't like comment on it, that can be a problem.
And I think one of the ways, because I actually, when I first sat down, I was writing these cover letter drafts and all these statements. I kept kind of my close friend, she was just like, but what else? Like, this is surface. You're not getting below. And she finally asked me, why do you want to be a professor? Just like the basic question. And I was like, I kept struggling. And it was kind of, for me specifically, the answer ended up being, well, I was like, I want to be the professor I never had. And for me, that was because I'm LGBTQ. And I was like, I never had a gay professor. And that's the type of professor I want to be for someone somewhere. And she was like, well, that's like your first sentence. I was like, oh. And then all of a sudden, everything just was aligned after that, because everything related back to this idea of how can I show up authentically? How can I help students feel respected in the classroom? And that informed my teaching statement, my research statement, and everything after that. So really figuring out and understanding that question and preparing before you get into all the nitty-gritty details is going to make everything flow very, very easy. Well, easy-ish. It's going to still take a lot of work and several drafts.
And to emphasize what Chris said, when we read something and it has like a very consistent authenticity, like authentic sound to it, like you can tell. I don't know, like I don't know how to like tell you how to do it, but like make sure you are presenting yourself in your documents. Don't try to fit what we want you to be, because you're not going to be able to do that for the next X number of years. Like, we want you to be who you are. And like, if that's a good fit both ways, then it'll work out. hopefully. We also have to like sometimes fight with the provost about getting enough people like to hire, but like if it, if it's a good fit both ways, it's a good fit both ways. And so be yourself.
And if there's some reason you want to be at that particular school, like sort of just say it, right? Like they want to know that you want to be there. If you can do it without being, fake or whatever. But like if you've only lived in big cities and they're in the middle of nowhere, they're going to be like, this person's not going to want to be here. But if you can just be like, actually, I grew up in maybe you'd say that somewhere along the interview, like to talk to someone, just sort of, just let them know that you understand what they're like and that you can see yourself there.
And there are a lot of questions that we are not allowed to ask. And that's because, there are a lot of parts of our identities that are protected, right? So, we can talk about, housing in Silicon Valley because that's something like I, as someone who's living in Silicon Valley, have had to deal with, right? And so like, I can have that conversation, but I can't ask you, are you nervous about housing in Silicon Valley? But feel free to ask those questions. Like there are things that we can't ask you, but if you want to know something, you can ask us. And, think about like level of comfort. You want to have like real conversations. So if you're feeling like you're holding something back because you're worried that it won't fit, start the conversation without that piece, like, keep that piece where you want, close to the chest as you want it. But if you feel comfortable with the people you're chatting to, like you can have that conversation. But like we cannot ask about basically about any of your demographics, which is also why they have to be pre-screened at offices that are not, our search committee. So
that was kind of,
unfortunately, I've had a couple of instances where those questions that Madeline says you can't ask have been asked anyway. Stand your ground. They don't get to know that.
Yeah, unfortunately that happens because you talk to a lot of people during interviews and they don't necessarily all follow what they should do.
Yeah, and typically the big thing that comes up in PUI searches is they want to know your marital status. I get why they want to know, but they don't get to know.
Yeah, sometimes they just want to help, right? Like maybe they can do like they can solve a 2-body problem, but yeah, if that's something you want to talk about, you're allowed to, or you can ask about, but they should.
Yeah, if it is a situation where you know that you need to have that conversation, it should be initiated by you. If they're initiating it, that's a bit of a red flag.
Yeah,
I would say though, sometimes students ask those questions. They might when we have students meet with faculty candidates, we always tell them like, hey, there are a bunch of things you can't ask. Here's the list. They don't necessarily read the list before the meetings. So
yeah, I'm talking faculty where
so certainly if students, faculty are asking it, but like if students ask it, you can stand your ground there too. Like just be like, actually that's not appropriate to ask in this stage. And like the students are in the process of learning, they'll be okay with it,
That is a good point that during an on-site visit, you probably will meet with students and take those meetings very seriously because they have a say in things. They probably, whatever you talk about with them, if they feel comfortable with you, if they enjoyed meeting with you, that's going to get back to the search committee. And if you didn't talk to them because they weren't important, that's going to get back to the search committee too.
Yeah, the lunch with students feels as important as the meeting with a dean or a talk with the president.
Probably more important
when you're doing those on-sites.
And a note on the piece with students there. So somewhere a point in which I got kind of a gold star that I later learned about was when I had a day and a half interview. It started at noon the first day, and then the second day was an all day. And it wasn't until the end of the second day when I actually had to sit down with students, other than at a meal time. And because I was flying from my postdoc that was in Europe, they had flown me in the night before. And because I was going to be like 6 hours ahead, I was waking up at 4 a.m. because it felt like noon almost kind of thing. And so I just asked if I could do a coffee with students before my first meeting. And so with that, it was kind of one of those, I'm like, I'd like to talk to students. And this is an opportunity that I found that you can use students to find out more about the department. So before I walked into my first meeting, I had an hour coffee with students. I did a gimmick. So, I mean, a big thing of PUIs and undergraduates is make yourself memorable. So I was coming from Europe, I was coming from Switzerland. I brought Swiss chocolate with me, and we had coffee and Swiss chocolate, and everyone remembered me as the one that brought chocolate. So that was a great little gimmick. Those are always fun. But I was asking the students questions, and I was like, hey, what do you think is missing from the department? What do you love about the department? What professors do you love? What do they do? And I just was asking them lots of questions. They loved answering them. They like trying to show off a little bit. And it was such a beautiful thing because I got to learn a lot about the department before I even went in and had my meetings. I brought up stuff that students were saying. I was like, wow, this student was talking about how you're doing this creative thing in your class. Can you tell me more about that? And so I really got to hear about places and things in the department that they loved. And I got to talk to people about it. And so I felt a lot more prepared walking into meetings, feeling like I actually knew what I was going to talk about.
Really great. Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes. We haven't really covered exactly everything on our list, but let's just open it up for questions if that's okay. While we're doing that, I have I'm going to throw a couple links in the chat. There was like a previous SLiTHEr a year ago that was on a similar topic. So I'm going to put the link to that. You can watch it on YouTube. And then there's also just like, if you want to give some feedback about this webinar, if it was helpful, you can fill that out. So go ahead and ask some questions while I do that. And if you have any. If not, I can read some more off your list. There was just like a question about like, how do these jobs compare to like a teaching position at an R1? Like, what's the difference about being a faculty member at a PUI, or just like what makes that unique?
So you do a lot of teaching. But your job is not just teaching. I would say you're more like a tenure track faculty at an R1 than you are like teaching faculty. At least, you know, I think it depends on the PUI. Some PUIs have very, very little research, so maybe it would be more like teaching faculty. But, you know, running my lab, the biggest, you know, one of the crazy things is that I don't have anybody to handle logistics for my lab other than me and my students. So, you know, you have to find other ways to delegate and make it work. But it works out great. You do a lot of research. You're in the lab a lot, and you're doing a lot of training, like a lot of training of students. And so they start a new type of experiment, and you're in there and helping them troubleshoot. They start a new type of technique, you're in there and teaching them how to use the instrument or how to use the glassware or whatever it is. But something breaks, and it's you and like the lab tech for your department figuring it out. And so that can both be a huge like time sink, but it can also be, if you can time it right with your students, and the technician can be a great opportunity for them to learn about the instruments and how they work. One more thing I would note about your application and like what you put into it, like think about the experiences that you've had that allow you to run a lab where you're the person who's kind of running everything, right? So if I was an NMR TA for years, so that helps me a lot in my job now, because I'm teaching students how to use NMR, and it also like gives me a really good perspective for, the new MRI that we're putting out on for a new NMR instrument, right? So like those types of things, cases where if you've mentored students in the lab, even if they're not undergraduates, but especially if you've mentored students who are undergraduates, put that in, tell us about it. Tell us what you learned from it. Tell us what you want to do better next time, or like where you felt like you were awesome. We're always going to ask about that. And so.
Yeah, I actually put that in my CV. I had a little description of every student that I ever mentored. What was their project? Great. What was their role? What was their interest? Again, another good thing that Matt Allen taught me.
I agree.
That can go in your CV.
I have one more question here. It sounds like your PI was really supportive. I know sometimes that like your postdoc or your grad school advisors aren't always supportive of people applying to PUIs. Did anyone run into that as an issue, or how would you deal with applying to PUIs? I think a good thing is to attend something like this that gives you some of the inside info, but any other feedback about that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So yeah, because my postdoc and PhD advisor were very supportive, but they were R1, and then the other one was in Europe, and so Europe does not have liberal arts colleges at all. So that was an interesting experience. But I had gone to a PUI. I went to Willamette University, so just down the road from Ann, actually. And so I had done a short little chat with my undergraduate advisor, which was really helpful. But then actually something I did that was a little scary for me at first, but I just started almost like cold emailing people that were just started positions, or I would like talk to a friend of a friend that knew someone that had just started at a PUI, and we would do an introductory email, and everyone I asked was more than happy to do like a 20-30 minute Zoom with me and just chat about things like, what should a startup be? What should I say I need? What's reasonable? And so I think just asking, most everyone will like say yes, or they'll say, I don't have time for that, but here's someone that maybe would be useful.
Yeah, to add, thank you, Viper. That was one way that I was handling what Chris had just talked about.
Yeah, networking is super important on that. I would also say, in terms of like asking what's reasonable in terms of startup or in terms of needs, you could also like, stake yourself at different levels. Like say, okay, if I have 25 grand, what can I do? If I have 50 grand, what can I do? If I have 100 grand, what can I do? If I have 150, what can I do? And kind of like, once you get through your applications, like get your applications out first, but then start thinking about like, what do those numbers actually mean and how much does that get? And keep in mind that like, you might have a situation where people are going to give you a lot of glassware because there's a lot available, or like there are places that you can get like donations for so like it depends on the type of school you're at and like what kind of stuff you have, but like there might be a lot of ways to make stuff stretch. And so you can also ask those questions when you get into interviews. If you're like, hey, so what is the typical startup, and like if I don't have this amount of money, like is there a way to like supplement that startup without necessarily just funds right off the bat? And so that kind of thing is available too.
And at a PUI, often you're not paying for all your gloves. The department often pays for that. So like it's a little different than an R1 lab where you're not paying for exactly the same stuff. Often like maybe all the gas cylinders will be paid for. There might be things that you might like think you need to pay for that you actually probably don't. So it's a little different. We're right at 4 o'clock, so I want to respect everyone's time. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording. If people need to leave, feel free to go. I can hang around a few more minutes, but I want to make sure people get their questions answered. But there is that other SLiTHER that you probably has a lot of other great information. I haven't watched it, I'll be honest, but I will after this. Thank you for our panelists and for all of you guys